And this is a seminar, although the title said one thing, but basically what I'd like to go over this evening is what Srila Prabhupada's role, as I understand it to be, in the ISKCON movement, both as the founder and as an Acharya, and therefore how the rest of us, including our initiating gurus, from what I understand, fit into or have a relationship with Srila Prabhupada. First, I'll give a little background of what inspired me to have this particular topic, and then what my understanding of our philosophy is. Hopefully it's in some kind of order. I'll be giving the same topic at our spiritual leadership course, and that will be for half a day, which is, I think it's 3 hours at least. This is a little bit more condensed. Well, a little background about how I came to the movement and how I developed some faith in Srila Prabhupada, and what I understand is scientific faith, and how it's essential to at least be part of ISKCON that we have scientific faith in Srila Prabhupada. Not just faith, but scientific faith. I first came to the movement in 1968, and that was in New York, in Buffalo. And before I joined the movement, and while I was in the movement, I was a student at the university there, and one day I decided to go to the cemetery. I was living some maybe 10 miles away from the university. I had my own apartment. And I decided to go to the cemetery because it was the nicest place in Buffalo. So you can imagine what the places that were not so nice in Buffalo were like. Because there's the one place that they had some flowers, of course, and they had a park, and they had some rocks. And I was just walking along, just as a disclaimer, because it was 1968, I hadn't taken any drugs or anything. And I was walking along, and I was looking around all these buildings. Everything turned into like a fairy tale, like a pastels. Everything was so vibrant. I was trying to wonder, where am I? And I walked to the park, and I looked at all the rocks, and I looked around. And I said, everything is unlimited, and everything looked so beautiful. I could hear the sound of the waterfall because there was a waterfall there. And I said, wow. This is not what they taught me at the university. And then I concluded there must be a supreme that put this together. And then I decided right there and then that the aim of my life was to find who the supreme was. So that week I became a vegetarian. I started to do hatha yoga because that's the only thing I knew, 8 hours a day, and I got a job. Along with going to the university, I was a model doing hatha yoga exercises. And at the same time, I started to study the Bible and all these books from the East. And I decided that my aim of life is to become Paramatma realized, because that's where the highest I got into. And I was going to the university and was trying to dissolve clouds in the sky and things like that. And then one of my friends, who later on became a sannyasi and a GBC and a guru within ISKCON, because we were friends when we joined, his name was Jeffrey Hickey. He later on became Jagadish Maharaj for some time. Then he told me that he was also going down to a temple there, and I decided to go down to the temple and visit there. And somehow or another, Krishna gave me more and more experiences in Krishna consciousness. As soon as I joined the temple at the beginning of 69, or at the end of 68, then they immediately made me the head pujari. Although at that time I didn't know who the deities were. I asked my friend who the deities were, and he said he didn't know either. And he was the previous head pujari. And then they made me the treasurer, which fit my personality. I think it was because I I noticed that the previous treasurer, as soon as I gave him a donation, he accounted for it. So I said, well, that's really amazing. And then I learned from Prabhupada's first treasurer how to become a treasurer, from Gargamuni. And he told me, Prabhupada's method of being a treasurer is you take in money, but you don't give anything out. And I had direct experience of that later on, because Srila Prabhupada asked me to open up a temple. So the first temple they sent me to open was in Coconut Grove, Florida. And Gargamuni Maharaj at that time, he was supposed to open the temple also. So his philosophy was, we don't spend any money on prasadam. And we didn't have to spend any money on rent because we were living in the park on the ground. And we were bathing in the kitchen sink and the park sink, and we were cooking on the grills in the park. So we saved a lot of money. Gargamuni had $100 that he'd gotten on his journey from Detroit to Coconut Grove, Florida, and he wouldn't spend it. So we ate from, I guess, a month or two or something. The only thing we had every day, we'd get up in the morning, we'd dust off our sleeping bag because it was pretty dirty, and then we'd go into the park sink and take a bath, and then we'd chant our rounds, and we'd start cooking on the grills. And Gopinath, who was his assistant, and myself, we cooked the chapatis, and Gargamuni Prabhu would cook the apple chutney. And then have a small kirtan, the hippies would gather around, and he put the apple chutney in the chapati, and we'd hand it out to everyone. And after we did that, we got our quota for the day of our meal. We got 2 chapatis and a little apple chutney for our meal for the day. So it was rather austere for a while. And then we'd go out on book distribution, distribute back to Godheads. And if we got back in time, which was rare, before the stores closed, we were able to get 1/4 pound of sour cream and 2 bananas. So I was getting a little thin. Anyhow, we saved money that way. So I eventually became the temple, I eventually became the temple president of Dallas, Texas, after some changing around. And one day I went to see Prabhupada, because every year we travel from Dallas by car, and we go to the Rath Yatras in San Francisco, and Prabhupada was usually in Los Angeles at that time. And since I was the temple president, I would go they would invite me to be in the garden with Srila Prabhupada when he was talking. So one day I came to the garden with Srila Prabhupada, and Karunda was there. And as soon as Prabhupada looked at me, he said, well, how is your farm going in Dallas? I said, farm in Dallas? I didn't know we had a farm in Dallas. The previous temple president, I guess he was a little more enthusiastic about these things. And then Prabhupada looked at me and said, are you convinced about Krishna consciousness? So I said, yes, Prabhupada. And then Prabhupada pointed to the tree. He said, do you see the bird in that tree? And I didn't see any bird, but I figured if Prabhupada said there was a bird, there was probably a bird. So he said, yes, Prabhupada. So he said, that bird in the tree, he has his home, he has his wife, everything. Krishna is giving him everything he needs. So why don't you think that Krishna will give you everything you need? So I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And then Prabhupada started to talk about some other subjects. And then Prabhupada looked at me again and he said, are you convinced about Krishna consciousness? So I said, yes, Prabhupada. And that went on. He asked me another time, a little bit later. So our philosophy is all centered around that Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And equally important is that we have a representative of Srila Prabhupada, of Krishna, who's perfect. Prabhupada writes in the Bhagavad Gita that in the introduction. Now I read the Bhagavad Gita, I don't want to say how many times, but quite a number of times. And one day I was reading the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, that happens all the time with me, because every time I read the Bhagavad Gita, it's completely different. When I first joined, we didn't have a Bhagavad Gita. we only had one verse, the translation in English, and that was, as the embodied soul continually passes from boyhood to youth to old age, etc. And I heard that lecture. Virjan Prabhu was there. He was a senior devotee because he joined 2 months before any of us did. So he was considered one of the senior devotees. So he was the one who gave the lecture 3 times a week at the University of Buffalo. And he didn't have a Bhagavad Gita. He didn't have even verse in Sanskrit. He didn't have a purport. He had only this verse. So I heard it, I don't know how many times when I first joined the movement, except for the Srimad Bhagavatam class in the morning. And the first time I heard the Bhagavatam class, because I had bought the Srimad Bhagavatams, but I didn't read it, Prabhupada's original Srimad Bhagavatams. So I walked into the class, I sat down, and the first thing I heard about our philosophy is that Asvatthama was throwing a Brahmastra at Arjuna. And the whole universe got lit up and was going to be destroyed. So I thought, this is rather an amazing philosophy. Anyhow, I heard that again and again, but the body, soul is continually passing, because Prabhupada didn't want us to read the Sanskrit or the purport from Radha Krishna's Bhagavad Gita, so that's all we had. So I was thinking, there must be more to philosophy than this. I'm hearing it again and again. I don't. And then when I finally got to New Vrindavan in 1969, I went there with some devotees, and we saw Srila Prabhupada, and he was giving a lecture on the same thing. And New Vrindavan was so austere. When I first saw when I got out of the car to go to New Vrindavan, there was no road, so we had to walk, but it was all mud, and we didn't have shoes at that time. As soon as we surrendered, as soon as we moved into the temple, we handed in all our karmi clothes. So we got bed sheets because we didn't have dhotis. And so the first thing I did is I put my foot down on the ground to go to New Vrindavan, to journey there. And my foot went right into the ground, and my tongue went right into the ground, into the mud, and it broke. So I spent a couple hours walking to New Vrindavan, and finally I got there. I went to, when New Vrindavan was just a shack at that time. And I went up to Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada was in the attic, and the bed was practically covered the whole attic. And a devotee who later on became Bhagavan Das and myself went up there, and Prabhupada looked at me and smiled and said, "So how do you like our jungle?" So that's what New Vrindavan was a jungle. And it was quite austere, because if you went to bathe, for instance, then you had to go down Agasura Ghat. That's where we bathed. And Agasura Ghat was a hill made out of mud, and you went down, you bathed where the rain collected, and then in the morning, early in the morning, we didn't have flashlights, so we didn't see where we were going, but we walked up the hill, which was muddy, so we were dirty when we went up than when we went down. What's that? Yes. Anyhow, so Prabhupada was giving lectures, and I was prepared to hear Denos Minyata Dehe. And I thought, wow, what a relief, I'm not this body. Now I finally understand why Krishna was giving this lecture 3 times a week at the University of Buffalo. So in the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada mentions that there was one American lady who requested him to recommend an edition of the Bhagavad Gita in English. And Prabhupada's response was that both in India and America, there was no edition that he could recommend, because none of the editions that he had, as I was familiar with, out of the 700 editions, none of them touched on the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. And then Prabhupada says the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita is as follows: that if you want to take a medicine, you have to take the medicine according to the instructions on the label or according to the expert physician. You cannot take the medicine according to a friend. So, Bhagavad Gita, Krishna spoke the Bhagavad Gita to convince Arjuna that he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And that's declared by many great personalities that in the Veda culture and by Brahma Samhita, Srimad Bhagavatam, etc. Then Prabhupada said this knowledge comes through disciple succession. That Vivishwan instructed the knowledge to his disciple, etc. And therefore the knowledge comes down, and it's relevant to all of us because all of us have a relation with Krishna in one of 5 rasas. But in order to understand Bhagavad Gita, we should be like Arjuna, a friend of Krishna and his devotee. But then Prabhupada says also that when we read Bhagavad Gita, we may not know Krishna, but at least theoretically, we should accept Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. We don't have to blindly accept it. We don't have to blindly reject that Krishna is God. But at least theoretically, we should accept it. And then Prabhupada said, in that submissive spirit, one will be able to make progress in hearing and understanding Bhagavad Gita. So in the same way, we've joined ISKCON. Or we're in ISKCON, or associating with ISKCON. So ISKCON means, at least theoretically, we're accepting Srila Prabhupada as Krishna's representative. Now, no one is forced to accept Srila Prabhupada as Krishna's representative. No one is forced to accept Krishna as God. That is based upon experience and knowledge. Now in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Aham sarvasya prabhavo matak sarvam pravardhate, that he's the source of everything. That's a big position. Unlimited opulences. Now one of his opulences is he has unlimited beauty. Now I've seen pictures of Krishna, I've seen the deities, and they're very beautiful. But as far as unlimited beauty, I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what it means to be unlimited wealthy. I pray to Krishna sometimes, and he gives me a few rupees. So I know he has something, some money. Sitaram's laughing because he's giving me donations. So but I don't know what it means that he has unlimited wealth, unlimited fame. I mean, everyone here knows about him. But maybe in India, most people know him. But where I come from, a lot of people don't know who Krishna is. Now, unlimited strength, well, we can point that out, but most people don't know him as the one who controls the sun and its orbit, etc. But as far as knowledge goes, that is the one thing we can all practically experience and discern whether Krishna has unlimited knowledge. Now we may not know it fully, but we have an access through the Bhagavad Gita to hear and use our intelligence to discern if this is perfect knowledge. If it's perfect knowledge means absolute scientific knowledge. True absolutely in the past, true absolutely in the present, and will be true absolutely in the future. That's true scientific knowledge. So Krishna begins Bhagavad Gita, if you can get through the first chapter, all the Sanskrit names, and get into the second chapter, Krishna begins his first instruction. First of all, he says that Arjuna's a fool, indirectly, so that's good information. It's a diplomatic way. He doesn't say you're a fool, Arjuna. He said a person who's learned doesn't speak like you. So that's good information, how to diplomatically tell people they're a fool. But his real first instruction is Denosmin ita dehe komaram yovanam jara tata dahantra pravtir diryas tatra namuyati. As the embodied soul is continually passing in a body which is going from boyhood to youth to old age, so this soul will enter into another body at the time of death. A self-realized person is not bewildered by all these different changes. So that's something which is discernible by all of us. Now, if we don't perceive it, then there's no use talking to someone. In other words, if people don't agree that their body is changing and that it's not getting younger, then there's no use really going further than that. Probably try that with Professor Kataski, who invited him to come to Russia, he told Professor Kataski, your body's changing. And then he told him, but you're not changing. That's proof that you're not the body. But he couldn't understand that. Then Prabhupada introduced Varnashram, that we should have persons who are honest and clean and true and whatever. Different qualities in the mode of goodness. And Professor Kataski, being a born-again Christian, who will be born again as something, he couldn't accept it at all. And the only thing Prabhupada could do is ask a question. Can you get me a taxi? And Professor Kataski couldn't do that either. So Prabhupada had to go on the street and find a taxi in Moscow. So generally, I remember one time I was preaching to someone at the University of Texas. I was trying to sell them a book. And I was showing him how the changing body changes all the time, but the soul is the same. And I asked him, where are you? Which body do you have now? And he pointed it out and he said, wow. He said, I'm not this body. That's great. So I gave him back the book and I said, take the book and just give a donation. And he gave me back the book. He said, I don't need the book. He said, wow, that's fantastic philosophy. And he shook my hand and said, thanks a lot. And then he left. That's called Maya. But it's perfect philosophy. It's the beginning of understanding that Krishna is actually giving real scientific knowledge, that we're eternal. And the next stage is Paramatma, which is more advanced. Vedanti tat tattva vidas tattva yaj jnanam avayam. Brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavan iti shabdite. So we've solved the first problem, that we're not the body. And if we read Bhagavad Gita carefully, Krishna will explain scientifically how he's in everyone's heart, giving everyone's remembrance, knowledge, and forgetfulness. How he's the overseer and permitter. How he's controlling the universe. That's why the planets are in their orbits. That's why the sun rises at a appointed time. There's so many discernible arguments that we can perceive with our intelligence, so we can know absolutely that Krishna is actually in our heart guiding us. Now, we're in Maya, at least I'm in Maya. So simultaneously we have intelligence, spiritual intelligence, which is being fed by Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, and is actually showing us scientifically how Krishna is Paramatma, how we're not this body, what the process of self-realization is to realize those things. But at the same time, we're being influenced by illusion. So we don't see things 100% clear, but it becomes clearer so we can understand this is actually truth. This is reality. And the Maya that we're under is absolutely illusion. It has nothing to do with the truth. And then, of course, there's Bhagavan. Now we know, for instance, that probably the example is given that we all had a father and mother. Is that right? Anyone disagree? And our father and mother most likely had a father and mother too. Grandparents. And we trace it all the way back, we probably find out that the original father and mother were also a person. If you go through your family album, you won't find, and when you turn the page, there's someone hanging from a tree, full of hair, and that's Grandfather Harry. And Grandmother Lucy is by his side. And you turn the page, and there's a black sheep. And then finally you've understood who the black sheep in your family was. And next to the last page is a rock. And there's a little caption, the most solid member of your family. And you turn the pages, there's nothing. And now you know what the source of everything was. Someone who's good for nothing. And Mother Nothing said to Son Nothing that you're good for nothing, trying to make something out of yourself. And he did. He was successful, and here we are now. So that's called science. Of course, we call it science fiction. But that's more or less, in a very general way, that's the viewpoint that most people have. And we can laugh and say, that's crazy. And people say, we're crazy. What do you mean your father and mother was a person? That's ridiculous. You're fanatics. You believe in this blindly philosophy. So why do we consider Prabhupada as an Acharya? What to speak of our Founder-Acarya, etc. Now, my experience with Prabhupada, the first time I saw him personally, was that, I'm just from my personal experience, he came to Buffalo in 1969 to visit, and I always I'm from New York, so I had a problem bowing down. Except I moved into a temple where the deities were, in order to go it was a shack, so the deities were, at first they were on a shelf, and Burjan Prabhu built an altar for them. So every time I came into the temple, I had to bow down. Every time I went to the kitchen, I had to bow down. When I got to the temple, the kitchen was right next to the temple room. The entrance, you immediately were in the temple room. If you had to go upstairs, you had to go through the temple room. So, I don't know, 50 times a day I was bowing down before the deities. It was great. I was a yogi, so, I was getting a lot of exercise. But I was afraid when I saw Prabhupada, I would forget to bow down. So Prabhupada came into the airport, and Prabhupada was floating. And I was so struck with wonder, I actually forgot to bow down. Later, I spent a week with Srila Prabhupada. I'd go up to see him every day. I remember the first time he gave a lecture at the university. When he walked in, I wasn't in Krishna consciousness. I was in Brahman. I was actually in Brahman. The whole scenery turned into Brahman. And Prabhupada sat down, and he gave the lecture, and he started to talk about God. So no one talked about God at the university. 4-letter words were normal. 3-letter words like God were forbidden. And so Prabhupada, half the audience got up and left, and I was thinking, well, Prabhupada, maybe you should change the subject. But Prabhupada didn't change the subject. He just talked about God. He didn't mention, I don't remember if he'd said anything about Krishna, but God he talked about. And I spent a week with Srila Prabhupada, and I realized he was quite perceptive. I mean, very perceptive. Because I was a devotee, and I had some spiritual experiences. So I was half a yogi and half a devotee. So I sat with Prabhupada one day, and Prabhupada was talking to me for hours. So I was getting a little bored, actually, to tell you the truth. And so I was thinking maybe I should see Prabhupada's aura. So as soon as I was trying to see Prabhupada's aura, immediately he stopped and said, our process is bhakti, it's not mystic yoga. So I thought, okay. That was the last time I tried to see anyone's aura, by the way. Later on that year, we went to all of the devotees went to see Srila Prabhupada in Boston from Buffalo, which means we first went to New York. We did Harinam there, but I went to see my parents because my sister was getting married. When my parents saw me in a dhoti and tilak, they didn't know what a devotee was, what to speak of. I was a devotee. And they walked in, my mother was like, wow, my God, what happened to you? She said, you can't be in here like that. You can't go to your sister's wedding like that. So I said, no problem. So I just got up and I left. I went down the escalator, and they went down another escalator and met me. They said, all right, at least for your sister's wedding, you can be there. So I went to my sister's wedding. I preached to all my relatives. And then I didn't see my parents for 7 years after that. But then they called me up and asked for forgiveness. So that was nice. And then I saw him every year, once or twice a year. Anyhow, then we went to Boston after that. And Prabhupada was coming to the airport. And we were having a kirtan upstairs because Boston Temple was rather a unique temple. It was a 2-story temple, and they had ISKCON Press below, and the temple was upstairs. Rukmini was the head pujari, Rukmini Devi. And I noticed we were having bhajans upstairs, and I saw Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The same painting is there. He has his arms out like this, and there's a kirtan party in the back, and it started to glow. I said, wow. And then Prabhupada walked up the steps, and the whole room turned into Vaikuntha. And I said, wow, I couldn't even remember what I was in anxiety about. And then Prabhupada sat down on the Vyasasan, and then he looked at me, and he knew exactly who I actually am. I mean, he gave me, I said, wow. And then he gave a lecture, it was the appearance day of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Disappearance, I'm sorry, it was the disappearance of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And Prabhupada gave a lecture and during the whole lecture, I was crying. I didn't know why I was crying, but I was crying for the whole lecture. And believe me, I'm not usually very sentimental. And then Prabhupada left the room, and then I was back in Boston again. So that was my personal experience, but that's not why eventually my understanding of Prabhupada being a perfect acharya. That's not all it is. Of course, my experience I haven't forgotten, and it becomes more of an experience sometimes the more I remember it. But because Prabhupada was, in other words, he was what's called in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Bhakti Samshanat. Bhakti Samshanat is a words given to Advaita Acharya to describe why he was an Acharya. When Jayadvaita Swami and Satsvarup Maharaj were on a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada one time, they asked him that Srila Prabhupada, sometimes it appears that you make mistakes. The Acharya they didn't say Prabhupada, they said sometimes it appears that the Acharya makes mistakes. He may misquote verses, or he may fall asleep at inappropriate times. So how do we understand that the Acharya is perfect? And Prabhupada said, you don't understand. He said the perfection of the Acharya is Bhakti Samshanat, how he's preaching the Krishna consciousness movement. So in other words, whatever faith we have in Srila Prabhupada is not due to because, we see Prabhupada in everyone's heart, or we see Krishna in everyone's heart, or the faith has to develop. But how do we develop the faith? We have to know what we're developing faith in. It's not that everything that Prabhupada said, from the mundane point of view, might have been perfect, from our relative conception of what perfection is. But if we understand that whatever Prabhupada was doing, if we see through those lenses, at least we try to see the lens of how he is trying to spread Krishna consciousness, how he's essentially trying to convince people or bring people to the conviction of those three things: that we're not the body, that Paramatma can guide us towards Krishna, and that the ultimate goal of life is to realize a relation with Krishna. And how to do that. And if we follow Prabhupada's instructions and Krishna's instructions, because there's no difference between Prabhupada's instructions and Krishna's instructions, then when we follow that, then Dadami Buddhi Yogam Tam. In other words, if we constantly engage or try to engage in Krishna's service and try to do it with a little enthusiasm, then Krishna will give us intelligence, reveal the divine knowledge to us. So in other words, that's how faith develops. Because that's what Prabhupada is trying to essentially give us. That's what Krishna is giving us. That's what our acharyas are giving us. The opportunity to understand Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. And if we by following Prabhupada's instructions, by following Krishna's instructions, by following our Acharya's instructions, if we get closer to realize Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, then we can actually develop faith, both in the Acharyas, the representative of Prabhupada, as the representative, and as Krishna speaking Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. He says, if you study Bhagavad Gita, you worship me by your intelligence. Now, any one of us who repeats the message of the Acharyas, specifically Srila Prabhupada, then we're also an instrument. Now, we may think that, well, this is just an ordinary person. But anyone who's repeating the message of Krishna in disciplic succession is not ordinary, according to Bhagavad Gita. They're under the divine energy. So what we're seeing is not, Bhaktin so-and-so or Swami so-and-so doing something. What we're actually seeing, experiencing, is the internal energy to one degree or another, manifesting itself, working. If they're chanting Krishna's glories, if they're endeavoring with determination to serve him, if they're bowing down before him, they're under the divine energy. So every devotee is like that to different degrees. When Srila Prabhupada met some politicians in India at the end of 1977, November, the end of October, beginning of November, they wanted to know who the next Acharya was. And Prabhupada said, actually, I'm not appointing the next Acharya. He said, all my disciples, all my followers, they'll be the next leader. As much as they've understood and followed my teachings, they become the next leader. We have one leader, Krishna, and everyone else becomes a leader as much as they're following him. So we have to judge someone like Srila Prabhupada, how he was chanting the names of Krishna, how he was bowing down before him, how he was serving him with determination. That's what all the biography is about. But even more important than that is Prabhupada's instructions, Prabhupada's example of distributing Krishna consciousness, specifically helping people understand Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. That's the Acharya. And the result is, Prabhupada writes, Bhakti Samshanat, how they're spreading Krishna consciousness. Or Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has given us a hint how we can tell an Uttama-Acarya. Now, an Uttama-Acarya has assimilated the Siddhanta. He's understood that there's no difference between Krishna and his name. He's understood his spiritual identity. And he has no other business in spreading the Krishna consciousness movement. Now, and Prabhupada writes that this is all meant to understand how we can engage in loving relationships with the devotees. This is the basis of our spiritual advancement. How to honor those who are superior, how to cooperate with those who are on the same level, how to help elevate those on a lower level. This is the whole basis of our advancement in spiritual life. And we should first of all understand who everyone else is on, what level they're on. So if we read Prabhupada's books, we see his example according to the testimony of others. We see the example of those who are following him. Then we can understand by our own experience what level of advancement Srila Prabhupada is on according to our current perception, whether Prabhupada is superior to us in understanding Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan, because that's the subject. And if he's superior, then we should follow him, and we should follow others who are superior also. But in our society, ISKCON, Prabhupada is the founder. He's founded it, and he's the one who we accept as the Acharya. And everyone else has to be seen in relationship to how strictly, how enthusiastically they follow Prabhupada. That's what ISKCON is all about. He said, no. He said, do you follow Buddhism? He said, no. He said, well, why don't you follow Buddhism? Do something. Just don't ask questions. So that's what our movement is. We're here because we have some faith in Prabhupada. We have some faith in Krishna. And that faith we can choose, because that's what the material world is all about. We can choose to follow Krishna, his instructions, or we can choose to follow our senses. We have a choice at any moment to do that. But here we are, we're trying to follow Prabhupada, and if we follow him, we follow those who are following Prabhupada, because as the disciplic succession goes on, then the result is we can see whether it's true or not. whether it works. And if it works, how can you say it's not true? If you add oxygen and hydrogen together, and you get water, how can you say it's not true? If you hear the body's changing, but we're not changing, how can you say it's not true, that we're eternal? How can you say there's no Paramatma? How can you say there's no Bhagavan? If that's not revealed to us, if that's not our aim of real revelation, maybe Bhagavad Gita has no meaning to it, won't have much meaning to us. But if that's our objective, and we follow the example of Prabhupada, we follow the example of his teaching, we follow the examples of those who are in line with Prabhupada's teaching and example, and we come to a higher level, then how can we not accept these persons as representatives of Krishna to one degree or another? Then gradually that should come, that faith will come, and our lives will become as Krishna conscious that way. Everyone has to choose a leader. Everyone has to follow a leader. There's no one who's not following a leader. Prabhupada writes, for the demons, Kamsa's an acharya. Hiranyakashipu's an acharya. For those in the mode of passion, Bill Gates is an acharya. For those in the mode of goodness, Bambi's an acharya. Bambi the deer, by the way. And for those who are transcendental, they have the acharyas in disciple succession. They become acharyas. Everyone has a leader. Everyone's following someone. It's up to us to decide who to follow. We've come to ISKCON. Prabhupada is the founder acharya, which means that everything, every instruction, every example that we should have should be following Prabhupada, should have reverence to Prabhupada, should have reverence to Prabhupada's teachings, should have reverence to Prabhupada. We see the acharyas through Prabhupada's teachings. We see Krishna's instructions as absolute, and Prabhupada is clarifying Krishna's instructions, just like our acharyas did. And if that helps us, if we actually understand Krishna's teachings through Prabhupada, and we understand everyone else's teachings who are in this movement, who are supposed to represent Prabhupada, through Prabhupada, and we see everyone else's example through Prabhupada's examples, because Prabhupada was very liberal, everyone is an individual, but still, basically speaking, there are principles that everyone's supposed to follow according to Srila Rupa Goswami, and we should see those who are representing Srila Rupa Goswami and Srila Prabhupada, our acharyas, they're in line with those principles. They may have details, everyone's an individual, but at least the principles should be clear to us what everyone is supposed to follow as representing our acharyas, specifically Srila Prabhupada. And then the faith, then we'll understand what founder means, what the acharya means, and what the rest of us means. It's not that anyone is restricted from becoming a pure devotee. According to Srila Prabhupada, according to Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, we go through the disciple succession, and if we don't go through the disciple succession, we're going through some other succession, which is not coming from Krishna, and we can't expect the same result as one who actually becomes faithful and intelligent in following the disciple succession, coming from our founder Acharya, coming from Krishna through our founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada. Thank you.